Senatrice Poirier.
Senator Poirier.
Honourable Senators, I rise here today to speak at second reading on Bill C-45, an act representing the cannabis and to amend the Controlled Drug and Substance Act, the Criminal Code and other acts, also known as the Cannabis Act. As per our rules, the debate at second reading focuses on the principle or merits of the bill and to raise general issues from the bill. Therefore, I will not be addressing specific details of the bill, but talk about the intent of the bill and whether this is the best course of action to protect our youth and their health. Like a lot of Canadians, I do have my share of concerns and doubts when it comes to Bill C-45 and its possible consequences if it is to receive royal assent. According to a Globe and Mail Nanos survey from last September, only 7% of the respondents said they believe that legalizing cannabis will lead to a decrease in consumption among Canadians younger than 18. Not only from various surveys, but also from Canadians who took the time to either write me, call my office, or stop by while I'm out on errands. All expressed their concerns. This is clearly a question that touches a lot of Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and that could have a lasting impact. The first concern which comes to mind for me from moving a drug from being illegal to legal is the perception of cannabis now being risk-free. I first experienced this perception last spring after visiting high schools in New Brunswick. As your honourable senators can imagine, the first topic they wanted to discuss was the legalization of cannabis. After a brief exchange, their perception was clear. Now that it will be legal, there are no harms to its consumption. Also, according to a survey conducted by the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse, published last year, it found that a majority of the youths were unaware that cannabis can be addictive and lead to withdrawal syndromes. Furthermore, according to a study published in 2015, evidence indicates that perception of harm associated with cannabis use is inversely related to rates of use among youth. There is also the risk of messaging by our government to our youth. On one hand, we are tightening the rules to prevent and minimize tobacco smoking by introducing plain packaging, social campaigns on its risk, and discouraging Canadians by increasing the tax on tobacco. And quite honestly, that approach has worked well. But right now, on the other hand, we are legalizing cannabis, which is mostly smoked, and sending the message that smoking cannabis is okay. Smoke cannabis, but don't smoke tobacco. It's almost like discouraging junk food like pizza with the help of a cheeseburger. Don't eat pizza because it's bad for you, but you are making cheeseburgers more available for Canadians. And the mixed messaging was increased in yesterday's budget. On one page, the government proposes to advance inflationary adjustments for tobacco to protect young people by making adjustments yearly instead of every 5 years. And on the other page, the government proposes to have lower taxes for cannabis to protect kids and dismantle the black market. So lower taxes for cannabis is supposed to keep it out of the hands of youth, but the experience with tobacco shows higher taxes achieve it. It's another mixed message for Canadians. The risk of legalizing cannabis, which is still illegal, is that it ends up being normalized. And once a substance becomes normalized, the obvious effect is increased use. And as I've read research or heard people talk about cannabis, there is already a general assumption that Canadians smoke marijuana from the black market, so we might as well legalize it to eliminate the black market and to improve public health. That approach in itself, I fear, will be a step closer to cannabis being normalized in Canadian society, hence why I believe it is even more important to ensure that we have strong education campaigns, tools and resources available several months prior to the legalization. Furthermore, the risk of normalizing cannabis in Canadian society could very well be heightened by allowing Canadians to grow up to 4 plants in their homes. It's the goal of the bill is to protect young Canadians from harms of the cannabis. How is exposing kids to cannabis plants in their homes protecting them? Having cannabis plants in their homes will just further normalize the cannabis as a harmless substance. I was happy to see that Quebec going forward by banning cannabis plants in homes and I hope other provinces will follow that step. And this again, another situation where the federal government lacks leadership. The minimum age required for cannabis in Quebec has been set at 18, while their neighboring provinces of Ontario and New Brunswick will be set at 19. It's already an issue with alcohol having different age requirements, and I've seen this in my own province, especially in northern New Brunswick. And now with the age difference in one province not allowing personal home growth, it's another loophole risking kids to being exposed to cannabis at a younger age. In the process, the federal government washes its hands of it by forcing the provinces to make the hard decisions and creating an unbalanced approach throughout the country. There is clearly a lot of work to do on the issue of perception. For example, Health Canada's survey from last December showed that many cannabis users are not convinced that it can cause impaired driving. According to the Canadian Cannabis Survey, only half of the respondents who had consumed cannabis in the last year felt that cannabis use affected driving, compared to 75% of all respondents. Another 24% said it depends, while 19% said cannabis doesn't affect driving. And what's most concerning is during, again, my visit to the local schools, I also questioned the students on driving under influence. I asked them if the driver had had 2 beers, would they get in the car with them? They all said no. But when I asked about cannabis, the answer was overwhelmingly yes. So time and time again, honourable senators, the challenge of perception is clearly present. These types of surveys and reactions are concerning. Yes, the government has invested some funds in public education, but is the amount enough? We're talking about $46 million over 5 years for the whole country, which by province and territory amounts to $2 million per region, which is less than the ice rink outside our front lawn. Is it enough for the message to reach Canadians, especially our youth? And is there enough time before cannabis becomes law for the message to be received and clearly makes Canadians aware of the dangers and risk of cannabis? In today's society, we are bombarded everywhere and at all times. Facebook ads, YouTube ads, TV, radio, tweets, Facebook feed, and from what our friends and families are up to, general interests, etc. It will take even more time and persuasion to reach Canadians in 2018 than it was when the tobacco campaign started in the late 1960s. Now, I'm aware that the government proposed to provide $62.5 million over 5 years starting in 2018-2019 for public education initiative in Tuesday's budget. But in all fairness, when will that money be made available for its purpose? And so close to the project date of the bill becoming law, how effective will the funding really be? The second concern for me, as it is for a lot of Canadians, honourable senators, is on the health implication from the cannabis. First and foremost, the health risk for our younger population is a huge concern not only for myself and members of this chamber, but also for the experts out there. As I am not myself an expert on the matter of brain development, I will not go into the gritty details of what can happen to the brain when cannabis is consumed by people aged under 25. But I've read what the experts have been telling us, and there is a clear link on the brain development when cannabis is consumed by people under 25. And that impact is greater the younger the user is. The younger the user, the more he or she becomes vulnerable to the developed mental health issues. According to a poll made by the Association des médecins psychiatres du Québec, 89% of the psychiatrists believe that legalization will lead to an increase in the use among legal-age young adults, as well as among underage youth. 79% of the psychiatrists think that the legalization of cannabis will hinder the functionality and the recovery of their patients. And to go beyond the statistics, honourable senators, please allow me to share part of an article from the McCain magazine titled "The Teenage Brain on Weed." It talks about a young man who started smoking cannabis at the young age of 14. As time went by, he started using more and more. His parents tried to stop him, but they eventually gave up, content that their son wasn't using harder drugs. That kind of told me that it's okay, says the young man. So I started using every day. After 5 years of heavy use, he noticed his short-term memory was starting to fray. He avoided talking to people. Worst, festering feelings of anxiety and depressions were growing. He tried to mask them with weed, deepening his dependency. He quit his job, broke up with his girlfriend, trying to find the source of his depression. After a minor argument with his sister at a family cabin, the young man fled and barreled back to the city in tears. He called a friend to take him to a mental health clinic. The young man, who had been prescribed antidepressants a couple of weeks earlier, spent 2 hours with the doctor and was told that he was what he had already suspected. He had a dependency on marijuana that was affecting his mental health, and he had to quit. This young man's story ends well, where he has stopped smoking cannabis, his depression and anxieties are gone, and he is more outgoing socially. Unfortunately, his short-term memory has suffered. At work, he has to make sure to write everything down. He did smoke at least once since he quit habitual use, although it was an eye-wakener, he says. His anxiety came back and he broke into a nervous sweat. It was direct evidence that I'm okay and I can do without this. Not only for mental health issues, but there needs to be more research done to measure the impact for physical health. Yes, there is some risk of consuming cannabis during pregnancy, as several studies have showed. But are Canadians knowledgeable on this? And have our healthcare professionals have these conversations with their patients? According to the result from a survey in France, only 51% of the healthcare professionals asked their pregnant patients about drug use, and approximately 68% did not feel sufficiently informed about the risk of cannabis use during pregnancy. I am aware the survey was made in another country, but these are questions to which we need answers before it becomes legalized, to make sure our health professionals have the proper tools and proper knowledge to protect Canadians. And what was more troubling for me, honourable senators, was the government ignoring the call by certain groups, like the Pediatric Chairs of Canada, that we need more research. On one hand, we have the experts on the matter of pediatric health calling for more research, a moderate approach, and a warning of the grave consequences for public health due to a gap in public education. And on the other hand, the government wants this bill to be adopted quickly in the name of public health. Why is the government not listening to the experts on this matter? It is baffling the experts who are asking for a moderate request to have more time for public education are being ignored by the government. Furthermore, my office had the chance to meet with the Canadian Nurses Association, and they too shared their concern. A new national survey revealed that only 62% of nurses considered themselves knowledgeable or very knowledgeable about the risk associated with recreational non-medical cannabis. These numbers are problematic since the nurses are the front line and backbone of our healthcare system. In the spirit of C-45, where the goal is to improve public health, how can we do so if only 2/3 of the nurses feel they have the required knowledge to effectively tackle this new reality? We need to give them the resources and the time to improve the knowledge for the current nurses, as well as to adapt the curriculum for future nurses. However, honourable senators, as I have read more and more on cannabis, whether it be by the healthcare stakeholders, medical researchers, municipality leaders, studies on the expertise in Colorado and Washington, it all came to the similar recommendation: don't rush it through. Yes, I acknowledge we have some of the highest rate of cannabis use in the world, and that is a problem. But according to a new study released by Statistics Canada last December, older Canadians, including senior citizens, are using cannabis, but fewer minors consume the substance. And I will quote the analyst Michelle Rotteman, quote, "This study and others has shown recently that use of cannabis among youth has either remained stable or has declined, whereas use among older individuals has increased," end of quote. To wrap up, honourable senators, we have the facts in front of us. Perception, what message are we sending to Canadians as we are cracking down on smoking tobacco? We are legalizing smoking marijuana. Pediatric and mental health representatives are concerned of the risk for our youth, especially for brain development and mental health. A gap of education for the Canadian public.
Your time has expired. Are you asking for more time?
5 minutes more, please.
Leave granted, all the senators.
Thank you. A gap of education for the Canadian public, especially our youth, but also for occupations like nurses who will deal with the possible consequence of the bill. We need to better assist them so that they, in return, be more effective, and therefore our public health will be better. Allow me, honourable senators, to read a letter I received from a concerned mother which demonstrates the real risk behind cannabis consumption. Dear Senator from New Brunswick, I am writing to you to express my concern about Bill C-45, which deals with the legalization of cannabis, and ask that you would vote against this bill, or at the very least, stall its passing. I have first-hand experience as to why I have such concerns over this bill being passed. I almost lost my 20-year-old son after a well-meaning doctor gave him a prescription for marijuana to help with some depression symptoms. He became suicidal and tried to take his life more than once. He then went into a full-blown drug-induced psychotic episode which required a full month on the psychiatric ward. It was a nightmare, to say the least. After much support and prayer, I'm happy to say my son is doing very well, and with no more marijuana. He's just about to graduate from firefighter school. Our story has a happy ending, but what about all the youth who are also at risk for increased depression, increased suicide tendency, and psychotic episodes through marijuana usage? Please do not pass this bill. Marijuana is not as safe as many assume it to be. There needs to be more study and more time given to such a huge decision. Respectfully, a concerned mother from New Brunswick, and I've left the name out. End of quote. In my opinion, we are going too far, too fast. Fully legalizing to meet an artificial and, quite frankly, a political deadline is not the best interest for Canadians' public health. All stakeholders, all the research have empathized on the importance to have strong education and awareness campaigns for all Canadians prior to legalizing. We need to ensure we're not sending mixed messages to our youth. We need to ensure that our health professionals are knowledgeable and well-equipped to meet these new challenges, and we need to clearly communicate to all Canadians, especially the parents and our youth, about the real risk behind cannabis use. If not, honourable senators, we don't feel the consequence of our decision on this bill, it will be our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren who will have to deal with the consequences, to which I ask, are we doing them a service or a disservice by going too fast into a barely charted territory? Thank you, honourable senators.
Senator Langton.
Thank you very much, Your Honour. Honourable Senators, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to participate in this discussion on Bill C-45 at second reading. And like Senator Poirier, I tend to speak to this bill in principle and raise the issues of concern that I would hope that the committee will spend some time delving into and hopefully providing their thoughts back to the Senate as a whole when they report out on this bill. I also want to take a moment at the beginning and thank those senators who, in doing research, have shared that research with all of us in this chamber. The sponsor of the bill, Senator Dean, has done a phenomenal job in pulling together a lot of information and making it available to any senator who wishes to do that, and far beyond government and Library of Parliament, from different symposiums and seminars. And I have to say it's taken over my reading completely, but very, very helpful. And a couple of things, for example, Senator Unger has distributed to all of us, putting forward a particular point of view and some research evidence that supports that point of view that she holds on it. I've found this a very engaging opportunity, and I even, if I may comment on the nature of the debate, the fact that we are speaking with each other each day and with 2 or 3 speakers, I find helps me really understand the perspectives around the chamber, and I'm learning from everyone that speaks. I mean, we all bring different understandings and perceptions and experiences and evidentiary facts that we're aware of to the table, and I think that that's helpful. I started my thinking about this from what's my position in principle going into second reading. And I will admit to, if I have a bias, it is a bias from years of working on community health and public health. I understand the concepts behind those issues, and particularly as they intersect with discussion around controlled drugs. So I started even looking at this from a perception of being open to what the government was arguing the purpose of the bill was in terms of a public health approach. And that, of course, raised the question for me. The debates often contrasted public health with the quote-unquote war on drugs. And I didn't realize how much I didn't know about the quote-unquote war on drugs and the history of that until I started doing some research. I, as a kid of the 50s and 60s, thought that at least the colloquialism of the war on drugs came about from President Nixon in 1971 and the Schaefer Commission. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but that's sort of where I assumed it started. And as I looked, I mean, Canada has a very long record of having been part of and having led on the war on drugs. And I looked back and found that in around 1909, I can't even read my writing, 1909 or 1908, then Minister of Labor Minister King, went out to Vancouver after there were race riots that took place in the Chinese community, primarily in the storefront areas where there were Chinese and Japanese business owners whose shops were destroyed and windows smashed. And I'd never heard of this. I didn't understand this early intersection between drug policy and race. And there's a number of places that it plays out in its history. It's interesting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, except to say that it's very interesting reading for people. He came back from Vancouver and brought in the Opium Act in 1908 or 9. 1911, it was amended. It became the Opium and Drug Act. In 23, cannabis was added. In 29, it became the Opium and Narcotic Act. For a long time, that was Canada's main stay approach towards controlling of drugs and its approach to drug policy. In 2011, the Safe Street and Communities Act brought forward amendments to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act with mandatory minimum sentencing. And I raise that because it was interesting, because this Senate at the time weighed in on that issue as it had impacts on Aboriginal communities, which is one of the focuses, of course, that we often talk about, that we bring to the lens and the filter that we bring to examining bills. And the following year, the Supreme Court ruled on this issue, and they made it very clear that with respect to sentencing of Aboriginal offenders, and if I can read from that decision, sentencing of Aboriginal offenders must recognize the history of colonialism, displacement, residential schools, and how that history continues to translate into lower educational attainment, lower incomes, higher unemployment, higher rates of substance abuse and suicide, and of course higher levels of incarceration for Aboriginal peoples. And so the Supreme Court set out the necessity for courts and justice, the system, to continue to understand, at least in the case of Aboriginal peoples, the circumstances, the societal, cultural, and justice circumstances that bring Aboriginal peoples to courts in these circumstances. So, you know, it was interesting, again, this Senate played a role. If I can go back to the States for a moment and talk about where I thought the war on drugs started with President Nixon. In '72, he set up the Schaefer Commission, and it was former Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer who chaired that. And I believe, you know, from my reading, that the president expected that it would be a rather straightforward and hard-hitting report that would continue to support the approach of the war on drugs. In fact, the Schaefer Commission came back, and they did not argue legalization, but they did argue for decriminalization. They argued for an end to prohibition. That was the context in which they were looking at it. Does the policies that we have in place in the United States, have they worked? They were looking at what's the impact of cannabis? That's what they were looking at, and what should we do going forward? And they made a recommendation to end prohibition, and in this case, the measure that they suggested back in 1972 was decriminalization. Nixon wasn't very happy with this. I thought one of the most interesting things was I found myself, as I was going through websites, landing on a section of the tapes from the Oval Office, as they become available in public, publicly accessible over the years. The tapes were there, and President Nixon was hopping mad about the Schaefer Commission. In fact, he called them something. I can't tell you what, because it seemed to be redacted from the article that I wrote. At least it was ... So I think that there must have been some profanity involved in that. But he was determined that, in fact, that was wrong-headed and that it would continue with the respect of the war on drugs. Previous to that, in 1998, France had undertaken a major study as well. The health minister had proposed a study, and a commission was brought together, and it was headed by a renowned researcher, Bernard Pierre Roch, and they found, they focused on characterizations and classifications of drugs, low impact, medium impact, high impact, and they in fact made suggestions, which weren't followed through with there either, that alcohol get moved up to very high impact and that marijuana get moved down to low impact. Interesting, that's where the evidence took them. Once again, the political response was, we're not going to touch that, we're not going to go there. 70 years, in 2014, I'm going to say, the New York Academy of Medicine issued a statement saying, in the long run, marijuana legalization appears to hold the greatest promise for effective and intelligent control of marijuana use. That New York Academy of Medicine made that statement in 2014 in the context of a 70-year look back to the LaGuardia Commission. Now, the LaGuardia Commission, issued by the mayor of New York at the time, someone who was, very small L liberal in his views around these things. He might have been large L liberal too, but small L liberal in terms of his views around drugs. And, he made it into sort of almost a personal war between him and Harry J. Anslinger, who was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Had very different views, but that LaGuardia Commission came out with some radical statements like, this is not a gateway drug, it doesn't lead to use of heroin, it is not a cause of juvenile delinquency. Like, things that we hear talked about now that are still being debated, that the research still doesn't, it's not that the research doesn't land anywhere or doesn't congregate to a certain opinion in its majority, but there's so much available that is of such low quality, not because of the work that was done, but because there has been an inability to do wide-ranging research with what was a controlled substance that researchers can't actually, it's illegal to grow it. So the kind of research agenda that has existed has been limited by the war on drugs approach that we have had. So I look at the history of this. I looked at the race impacts, whether it was Aboriginal peoples or, who has been mostly negatively impacted by the war on drugs approach, and I see that it is people of poverty. I see that it is people of color, largely in the U.S., and I think those questions of what the impact of that policy has been, who pays the most for that policy, how it relates with other issues like race and like our overall history on prohibition and other things, are all important context setters for how this debate comes to us. But where I end up today, before we have the opportunity to examine this in committee, is to want to say that I support the public health approach. I will therefore, in principle, support this bill, but I want to raise a number of issues of concern. And I want to thank other senators who have done that. So Senator Neufeld yesterday gave a very, I think, moving presentation of the issues as he's seen them and as he's experienced them in his life and his hopes and aspirations for his grandchildren. I think sharing his own personal experiences with us was powerful, and it is bold, and I appreciate it. Senator Batters, in questions that she's asked here on this issue and on other issues, it points to the importance of resources for mental health and treatment for mental health, and she brings a tragic life experience to that. It's important that we hear each other as we talk about these things from the experiences that we all have and bring. Senator White and others who are from policing background bring a particular perspective. I'm from a public health background. I bring a particular perspective. But there are reasons why we say the things that we do. And I believe that none of us want to move into this debate on the basis of moral or opinions or ideological opinions. We want it to be evidence-based, but we have a problem in that the evidence can take us different places, and we have to try not to be led only to look at the evidence that supports the incoming assumptions. I don't think I'm wrong to say that the majority of opinion scientifically actually comes to the point that the war on drugs as a policy is a failed public policy, and that a public health approach is the better way to go. But in that, there's a whole lot of things that we don't have the answers to that people have raised as concerns. And so I hope the committee takes its time to, I'm just losing track here of the amount of time I have left, but I hope the committee takes its time to look at things like where do we need more research? There's a lot of dollars in research been announced. Where do we need the research, and how do we get the people on the ground, the provinces and the federal government to collaborate and to define that focus and get research that's going to help us move a public health approach forward. The black market eradication, there's lots of issues around that. Have they got the pricing and tax policy correct or not? It's a policy choice for them to make where they're going to set it. What's the evidence that supports them to set it where it is? It's worth looking at and understanding. With respect to home growing, is that part of what they are putting forward as a way to eradicate the black market? It raises questions in of itself. How do you have quality control on what the product is if it's being grown in people's homes? That's a very important question. On the other hand, if someone can grow 4 plants and not go to the street corner to buy it from the black market, does that help eradicate the market? I don't know the answers, but I would like those questions to be raised. The parents' role, we've heard a lot about if we have these in the growing in the home, that children will have access to it. Well, I see it the same as if children are in a home where someone is brewing home beer or making wine at home. Those substances are there, and you could have access to them as well in someone's home. So the role of how we educate and equip parents, I think, is really important, and the work has begun on that. Those kits have been being distributed, and more work needs to be done. But that prevention, education, we have seen how powerful it has been over the years with tobacco. I had the opportunity to be part of banning the sale of tobaccos in drugstores in Ontario, and the banning of vending machines, because kids used to be able to walk in foyers of restaurants and bars, not go inside, but go in and get the cigarettes from the machine. Those kinds of moves, along with the kind of education, has had a profound impact, and we need to do the same in this area. And I don't disagree with people who say that it would have been better if we had started this 3 years ago. May I ask for, Mr. Chair, for another 5 minutes?
That's 5 more minutes. Is that agreed, colleagues? Carried.
Thank you. I want to talk about, people have mentioned youth consumption, and obviously the prevention information is critical, and Indigenous communities. So those things have been covered. I want to talk just for the last 3 minutes about the intersectionality between youth, mental illness, cannabis, and employment. These things are all connected. I've spent a bit of time in around 2011 and 12 reading OECD reports about mental illness and the impact it was having on our economies, on workplaces, on employers, accommodation costs, lack of accommodation and the costs of that, and the connection now to young people. There's research being done at places like CAMH on the aspiring workforce, where they're working with former patients and clients and looking at the connection to work as part of the treatment modality for mental health. There's so much that we don't know. And on youth mental health and youth brain development, there's a lot of stuff swirling around, and most of it will tell you it's different for every person. So once again, we have to give information and ammunition to individuals. There is an institute in north of Toronto called the Pine River Institute, which is a treatment resource. They and many others are suffering from having 29 funded beds for youth with mental health and addiction problems and 200 people on the waiting list. And every one of us could give those examples of organizations that we know. I believe we need to be calling on the federal and provincial governments to a Fed-Prov process of developing a youth mental health framework and resources for the kind of interventions and treatment that need to happen. And only one of the reasons is cannabis and what we have yet to really know about how to determine safe levels of cannabis use, if there is such a thing. The last thing I will just say is, as I've looked at this and wondered, what do all those questions mean and where do they lead? Do they lead to potential amendments? All of that to be determined. But I look at this also as, from the basic principle of supporting a public health approach, that I also will look at the Salisbury Convention, that this is a bill and a public policy approach that the government campaigned on, that they put forward, that the people have voted on. Where there are choices to be made, I'll question them on those choices. If I think there's a better choice, I'll try to convince them. But I would suggest that in most of these situations, what we would see as an appropriate way forward is for the committee to attach significant observations on these issues and really try to engage the government in doing something like a Fed-Prov strategy on youth mental health and resources for treatment and research focused on that. And so I'll leave my comments at that for second reading. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I appreciate all those who have contributed to my thinking on this as I've been listening. Thank you.
Will you take a question, Senator Lankin? Yes.
Very quick. You said there'd been a lot of research done. Parliamentary Secretary Blair announced research money very recently, last-minute research money, $1.4 million to fund 14 research projects across Canada. Do you think that's a lot of research funds for a subject of this magnitude?
1.4 million? 1.4. No, I don't think that's a lot of money, but I don't think that's all the money that has been earmarked for research either. I think the budget just put forward another $10 million yesterday. 20 million? Sorry, another $20 million yesterday. But I think that this whole area needs to have a pincer focus to what we need in the early days to answer through research questions, and that has to be a coordinated approach and not only driven by the research interests that are applying for these grants. There has to be, from a public policy point of view, some things that we really want to know that we should collaboratively with the provinces direct that research towards.
On debate, Senatrice Petitclerc.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Senators, it's a privilege to join in this debate on C-45. Let me first thank the sponsor, Senator Dean, for his work and for his exceptional collaboration with all of us. I would also like to thank all colleagues who have added to this very rich debate.
Every one of you, I have a vision of where I see our country going. I have a vision for the future I want for my little boy and for generations to come. These visions that we all have, of course, they come from who we are, our backgrounds, experiences, values, choices. So, as a small-town girl turned high-performance athlete, it will not surprise you that my dreams for our youth is very ambitious. I see a country where our kids are healthy, active, thriving, with no limits to what they choose to accomplish. And it's not really what's happening right now. Now, I'm not naive, and I know that building a country is not that simple, but you see where I'm coming from. And you can understand that when it comes to Bill C-45, well, and I've told it to Senator Dean a couple of times, let's just say that I'm struggling. I can't shake the feeling that we are taking a big leap of faith with ahead of us a lot of unknown and some serious risks. Je comprends fort bien que notre rôle n'est pas...
I certainly understand that our role here is not to make value judgments on a government bill, especially given that this government initiative has been backed by 65% of Canadians in the election campaign. But I also know that we have, as legislators, a true responsibility to protect the most vulnerable, in particular, young persons. What we do know is that Bill C-45 will allow adults to access regulated, tested, quality controlled, labeled, and tracked products.
Mentioned. What will the impact be on illicit market? How will personal culture of cannabis be possible to regulate and monitor? How can we make informed review of a legislation when the data we have access to is so recent with little baseline on an illegal product? It is complex, and I don't even want to think about 1 year from now. Someone will have to answer the very important question that no one has yet dared to ask. How on earth will we baby-proof a muffin? But the question that is keeping me up at night when I think about C-45 and our youth is the whys. 21% of youth have reported using cannabis in 2015. 30% of young adults have said using it. So why is that? Why Canada has the most, or one of the most, cannabis use among developed countries? Surely we cannot be comfortable with that kind of record. And is legalization how we intend to respond to this alarming situation? I have some doubts and questions, and in fact, I'm puzzled. We have been told by many and often how Bill C-45 is intended to answer a health crisis and is all about harm reduction. If it is a question of health protection, and I do hope it is, if it is a public policy answer to an already existing health problem, then why are the health professionals and scientists not listened to the extent that I believe they should be at so many levels? I like to see the coherence between the declared intention of the bill and the measures that are proposed. For example, when it comes to packaging, the McClellan's report has advised strongly for plain packaging, and yet the government is not going in that direction. Some have stated that Bill C-45 will not have an impact on the normalization of cannabis. Well, like many, I have my doubts, and I'm not sure I agree. In fact, I would argue that when we look at the high number of consumption we have, especially in our youth, well, it is already normalized, and legalization, I'm not sure will fix it. Listen around you, and I think at some level it's happening already. Only last week, an 8-year-old in my surrounding, knowing what I do here, told me, so this means that I'll be okay to smoke a joint in 10 years. I do hope that these comments are exceptions and not a reflect of conversations happening all around this country. In fact, I have a really hard time getting convinced that young kids consuming cannabis will change the way that they do it. In the small town where I grew up, like thousands of little towns like them in Canada, things were quite simple. If you were into it and your parents could afford it, you played hockey or you did figure skating. If not, well, you hang out, and you hang out a lot, and you get bored, and some kids got into trouble. We all knew exactly where the local dealer would hang out, not too far from the school. And I know for a fact, because I called a former teacher, that there's still someone exactly at the same place. And we all know, if we are being honest, that he will still be there after Bill C-45 comes into force. The Canadian Psychiatric Association, like many medical scientists, have warned us that the brain remains vulnerable to cannabis in very unique ways until 25. Senator Hu and others raised this concern thoroughly in the second readings, and I will not repeat them, but I wanted to say that I do share those concerns. The medical science is not disputed, and yet while our government says that C-45 aims for public health and harm reduction, it does not seem to listen to its own medical community by protecting our youth properly until 25. And yes, I understand and I hear the logistic reasons to go for 18, but should harmonization with alcohol and tobacco legal age be the priority or a priority on a bill that is supposed to be all about harm reduction? I'm not too convinced. I know that we have to be realistic. Kids and young adults will always want to experiment, push boundaries, and try new things. This is normal and for the most part harmless. But we need to make sure that no one goes from experience to waste of potential, talent, life, and addiction. From those many concerns that I have, I'm strongly convinced, as advised by many organizations, including the Canadian Medical Association, that the key to protecting our youth will be education, awareness, information. Washington has committed to invest a little bit over $1 per person per year. Colorado goes for $1.64 per person per year. Our government had decided so far to invest, in average, 20 cents per person per year. Very little has been done to date to increase public education about the risks of cannabis. The government readjusted its financial commitment yesterday when it tabled the budget, allocating an additional $62.5 million over 5 years, in addition to the $46 million already committed. This certainly is good news that we welcome, but we are still only at an average of 60 cents per person per year. So how will this be enough, if I may ask? Cultural and social change is long, it's slow, it's arduous. Think about how many years after legislation it took for individuals to start using their seat belts when driving, how many years it took to get the behaviors of drunk driving to improve. And perhaps the best example is tobacco. Even after we knew it was killing Canadians, it took decades and massive investments in education and awareness for our tobacco rate to go to the now historical low of 16.9%. So my point is, we can't afford to wait and react or readjust down the road. We have to be cautious, aggressive, and proactive from the start. And I'm not too sure that we're doing this. Pourquoi est-ce qu'on n'a pas commencé la...
Why didn't awareness raising and public education begin months ago, long before the act would come into law? The minister's answer to such questions in the Committee of the Whole wasn't very clear, even though Senator Smith, the Leader of the Opposition, put them several times. Of course, there have been some measures undertaken, and we're aware of them. In March 2017, Health Canada launched a digital campaign along with Drug-Free Kids Canada. They created the brochure Let's Talk Cannabis. About 180,000 of these have been distributed so far. We also know that across Canada in March 2008, so very soon, a vast campaign of public education will be launched.
But allow me to doubt that 180,000 traditionally printed pamphlet distributed on demand is the optimal way to reach our youth. In this day and age, one could hope for something a little more creative and dynamic. I, for one, have not been reached by any awareness message. Now I know, maybe I'm just too old for that. And may I remind you that in the panel organized by Senator Ho, with leaders from the pediatric community, I was amazed at the end that they did not even know that some awareness campaign or education had been even done. So that really says something about efficiency. If Bill C-45 is about health policy and harm reduction, health must be the priority. Legislation alone will not address the challenges of our youth, being among the highest consumer of cannabis in developed country. Education, awareness, and debanalization, denormalization of cannabis is, I believe, the only way to do it. Before I conclude, allow me some latitude to go a little bit out of scope and share what deep down really troubles me. At some point, we as a country will need to take a step back, look at our youth challenges, not only in silos, but as a whole, and really decide how important it is to tackle those challenges in a more comprehensive manner. Think about this. Our youth, as we learned with Bill C-45, is among the highest consumer of cannabis in developed countries. To add to these statistics, here are a couple more that paint a sad picture. Le récent portrait de Statistics Canada mérite notre attention.
Statistics Canada recent snapshot of our youth is worth paying attention to. 40% of 18 to 34 years old are overweight or obese. Over 1 of 6 young people spends 150 minutes practicing a physical activity every week. Only 25% of young men, 37% of young women between the ages of 18 and 34 actually eat the 5 recommended portions of fruits and vegetables a day. And 1 youth out of 4 between the ages of 20 and 29 is in poor cardiovascular health. The suicide rate amongst our young people is among the highest in industrialized countries, especially in some of our communities, and we're all aware of that. And our young people have some serious issues with school dropout. So what's up with our youth? Why these worrisome figures, these alarming figures?
For that, do we not have higher expectations for our youth? Et que fait-on pour y remédier de façon...
And what are we doing to address this in a structural way, not just with a hodgepodge of disparate measures?
Know that a very strong, quantifiable commitment from our leaders to social changes, education, awareness, will be part of the solution. And while we are going to study this bill in committees, I do hope that we keep in mind that we have a role to play in that bigger picture. Bill C-45 is addressing only a small part of the landscape when it comes to the challenges facing our youth, but it is an important one, and we just can't afford to get it wrong. Merci.
Senator Martin.
To the debate.
Senator Martin, second by the Honourable Senator Smith, that further debate be adjourned until the next sitting of the Senate. Your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion. Adopted, carried.